Have you ever thought that a risky decision made within a matter of weeks could change the entire destiny of a nation? On February 8, 2026, Japan witnessed something unprecedented in its post-war history. A woman leading the land of the rising sun, for the first time in its democratic eras, secured a landslide victories with nearly 70% of the seats in the House of Representatives. Sanae Takaichi didn't just win, she won completely, in a way that were almost unimaginable. But this is not a fairy tale of a success. This is a story about the pressures, about different choices, and about a nation facing its greatest challenges in the nearly centuries, placing its best on the person. And now this woman, arguably the most powerful in the world, must prove that this trust was not a mistake.
To understand the magnitude of this moment, we need to go back in time a bit. The Liberal Democratic Party (LDP) has dominated Japanese politics since 1955 for over 70 years. Only twice have they briefly lost power, and each time was like a political earthquake. But even in its glory days, the LDP never achieved an overwhelming supermajority like this. 316 seats out of 465 inches, the lower house. This figure isn't just a victory, it is a colossal vote of confidence from the Japanese people. You see, in politics, there is an unwritten rule. When you have absolute power, you also have absolute responsibility. And this is where the story gets interesting. Because Sanae Takaichi is not your typical politician. She is not the scion of a prestigious political dynasty. She is not the heir to a legacy of power like many of her predecessors. She comes from a middle class family, speaks bluntly, and most importantly, she is a woman in a society that still holds many gender prejudices. But don't let that fool you. Sanae Takaichi is not a symbol of softness. She is an ardent nationalist, a staunch social conservative, and a proponent of expansionist fiscal policy. In the political war, they call her a hawk, someone ready to confront China, ready to talk about nuclear weapons, and ready to break taboos that many other politicians are afraid to touch. So, how could someone like that win broad support from across the country? The answer lies in the current state of the world. We are living in an era where the old rules no longer apply. Donald Trump has returned to the White House for a second term. China is increasingly asserting itself in the South China Sea and beyond. North Korea remains a nuclear threat, and Russia, the neighbor to the north, is hardly a friendly ally. The Japanese people look out at the world and see instability. They see that the security commitments from the US, which they have relied on for decades, are no longer as certain as before. They see that the era of peaceful and quiet prosperity has passed, and in that context, a leader like Sanae Takaichi, with her blunt talk about harsh realities, became appealing. She capitalized on the Japanese voters' desire for both security and change. This is a paradoxical combination, but a very effective one. People want to be protected, but they also want to escape the stagnation that has haunted the Japanese economy for decades. They wanted a strong leader, but they also wanted a breath of fresh air. And Takaichi, as the first woman, represented both. But now, having won a historic victory, the real pressure begins. Because it is one thing to promise change, it is another to deliver it. And the challenges Japan is facing are not trivial. They are deep structural issues that have existed for decades, and there are no easy solutions. Let's start with the biggest problem, demographics. If you look at Japan's population pyramid, you see an alarming image. The country is aging faster than any other developed economy. The birth rate is falling to record lows. Every year, there are more deaths than births, And this is not just a social problem, it is a slow motion economic disaster. Think of it this way: an economy is like a machine, and workers are the fuel for that machine. When you have less fuel, the machine runs slower. But the problem is even worse than that. As the population ages, Social Security costs skyrocket. The healthcare system must care for more elderly people. The pension system must pay out more, and all these costs fall on the shoulders of a shrinking workforce. Many Japanese politicians have tried to solve this problem for years. They have offered incentives to encourage childbirth. They have reformed family policies, but nothing has truly worked. Because, as the economist pointed out, a family is not a production line where you can simply crank up the speed. Demographic change, like climate change, requires continuous adaptation, not a quick fix. So, what should Takaichi do? According to analysts, she needs to focus on two directions. First, maximize the human resources Japan already has. This sounds simple, but in reality, it is not. Japanese society still has many structural barriers preventing women from fully participating in the workforce. Look at Japan's tax system and family laws. They are designed around the traditional patriarchal model where the man goes to work and the woman stays home to care for the family. If a woman earns too much, the household loses tax deductions. This creates a strong financial incentive for women to only work part time at low wages. This is a massive waste of talent. Furthermore, Japanese corporate culture still relies on the lifetime employment system, where age and seniority determine pay and promotion, not ability. This means that skilled people who do not follow the traditional path are left behind. It also means companies are inflexible and cannot adapt quickly to market changes. Takaichi needs to break these structures. She needs to reform the tax system to encourage women to work full time. She needs to push companies to shift from a seniority based system to a skill and performance based system. These changes sound simple on paper, but in reality, they require touching upon deep cultural values that have existed for generations. And then there is the second direction, immigration. This is a extremely sensitive topic in Japan. For decades, Japan has prided itself on its cultural homogeneity. The country has one of the most restrictive immigration policies among developed economies, but reality is forcing them to change. Without immigrants, Japan simply won't have enough people to care for the elderly, work in industries, or sustain the economy. Some steps have been taken in recent years with the expansion of visa programs for foreign workers, but these changes are still very timid, and Japanese society still holds attitudes that are not very friendly toward immigrants. This is where Takaichi's conservative nature could become a problem. As a nationalist, she might be tempted to stoke anti foreign sentiment, especially in a political climate where populism is on the rise. But if she does that, she will push the country onto a path of self destruction. Japan needs immigrants. This is not an idealistic choice, but an economic necessity. Now let's move to the second issue, security. This is the area where Takaichi is expected to make the biggest changes. And it is also the area where her landslide victory offers the greatest opportunity. For decades, Japan has lived under the protective umbrella of the US. After World War II, Japan's pacifist constitution, imposed by American occupation forces, strictly limited the country's military capabilities. Article 9 of the Constitution states that Japan renounces war as a sovereign right of the nation. In practice, This means Japan can only maintain self-defense forces, not a full-fledged military, but the war has changed. Shinzo Abe, prime minister from 2012 to 2020 and a key political mentor to Takaichi before his assassination in 2022, began the process of strengthening the armed forces to respond to China's assertiveness and American unreliability. But as the economist noted, the world has changed faster than Japan. Takaichi has proposed bold steps. She has accelerated the plan to increase defense spending to 2% of GDP from 2027 to the current fiscal year. But this is just the beginning. Because the issue isn't just money. Japan needs a comprehensive confrontation with a new chaotic world order. What does this mean in practice? It means Japan needs to develop a stronger defense industry capable of producing advanced weapons without relying on imports. It means investing in defense innovation, especially in areas like cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and space warfare. And it means strengthening the country's intelligence capabilities to predict and deal with threats before they become serious. But perhaps the most audacious aspect of Takaichi's approach is her willingness to speak about taboos. For decades, nuclear weapons were a completely forbidden topic in Japanese politics. As the only country ever attacked with nuclear weapons, Japan has had a strict non nuclear policy, but Takaichi has broken this silence, mentioning the possibility of nuclear sharing with the US or even developing its own nuclear deterrent capabilities. This has caused a wave of controversy. Many Japanese people still have deep memories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But supporters argue that the current war requires facing harsh realities. When China, Russia, and North Korea all have nuclear weapons, and when the US commitment to the nuclear umbrella becomes uncertain, Japan may need to reconsider its options. Of course, strengthening defense cannot happen in a vacuum. It requires skillful diplomacy, and this is where Takaichi will face one of her toughest tests: managing the relationship with Donald Trump. Trump has returned to the White House with an America First agenda even more aggressive than his first term. He has questioned the value of US alliances, demanded allies pay more for US protection, and shown a willingness to cut deals with adversaries like China and Russia if it serves American interests. For Japan, this creates a difficult situation. Unlike NATO members, Japan cannot afford to alienate the US. The nation is surrounded by nuclear armed adversaries, and currently it depends on the US nuclear umbrella. But at the same time, Japan cannot just sit and hope that the US will always be there. Takaichi seems to understand this delicate balance. She has done an admirable job of keeping good relations with Trump. In fact, Trump even endorsed her before the election, a rare gesture for a foreign leader. But keeping good relations with Trump does not mean complying with his every demand. Here, Takaichi can learn from her political mentor, Shinzo Abe. Abe had a warm relationship with Trump during his first term, but he also knew when to work around Trump, not just with him. When Trump withdrew from the Trans Pacific Partnership TPP in 2017, Abe did not give up. Instead, he led the remaining nations to salvage the deal, turning it into the CPTPP, Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is a kind of diplomacy Japan needs to demonstrate more of in the coming years. The war is fragmenting into competing geopolitical blocs. China is building its own system of alliances and partnerships. The US is retreating from its traditional global leadership role. In this context, Japan has the opportunity to become a stabilizing force, connecting democracies and market economies together. One specific idea suggested by The Economist is that Japan should lead the effort to link the CPTPP with the European Union. This would create a trade bloc covering more than 30% of global output, a powerful counterweight to China, and a strong signal that democracies can cooperate even if the US does not lead. But all these global ambitions must be balanced with harsh domestic realities. And this is where we come to the third issue, the economy and public finance. Japan has one of the highest public debts in the world, over 250% of GDP. This number is massive, far exceeding most other developed economies. For years, economists have warned that this debt level is unsustainable, that one day the bond market will revolt and Japan will face a debt crisis. But so far, that hasn't happened. Why? Because most of Japan's debt is held by domestic investors willing to accept extremely low yields, and because the Bank of Japan has bought a large amount of government bonds as part of its quantitative easing policy. But the situation is changing. Inflation, after decades of deflation or low inflation, has returned. This is forcing the Bank of Japan to start raising interest rates, albeit very slowly. And when interest rates rise, the cost of servicing debt rises too. At the same time, demand for government spending is skyrocketing. Defense spending is increasing. Social security costs for the aging population are increasing. And now, Takaichi has promised to suspend the 8% consumption tax on food for 2 years, all without issuing new debt. This is where Takaichi's nature as a fiscal dove becomes a concern. In economics, a hawk is someone who prioritizes controlling inflation and fiscal discipline, while a dove prioritizes growth and jobs, even if it means accepting higher deficits. Takaichi clearly belongs to the dove camp. The problem is, while voters might believe in magical thinking that you can cut taxes and increase spending without increasing debt, the markets are smarter. If investors start worrying about the sustainability of Japanese public finances, they will demand higher yields on government bonds. This will increase borrowing costs, forcing the government to cut spending elsewhere or raise taxes. In the worst case scenario, it could lead to a financial crisis. So, what can Takaichi do? The economists suggest this might be the right time to gradually repatriate profits from overseas assets. Japan is one of the largest foreign investors in the world, with trillions of dollars invested in bonds, stocks, and other assets globally. If the government can encourage Japanese investors to bring some of that money home, it could help finance domestic programs without issuing more debt. But this is also complicated. If there is a massive flow of money back into Japan, it could strengthen the yen, making Japanese exports more expensive and hurting manufacturers. It could also cause volatility in global financial markets. Therefore, any such move must be executed carefully and in coordination with other central banks. But perhaps the biggest risk Takaichi faces is not economic or security related. It is herself. It is a danger that she will misinterpret broad support as a license to pursue her narrow ideological goals. Consider the issue of Yasukuni Shrine. This is a shrine in Tokyo honoring Japan's war dead, including 14 Class A war criminals from World War II. For many Japanese, especially nationalists like Takaichi, the shrine is a symbol of sacrifice and patriotism. But for China and South Korea, nations that suffered under Japanese colonial rule and aggression, visits by Japanese leaders to the shrine are seen as a deep insult, a denial of war crimes. If Takaichi decides to visit Yasukuni, it will ignite relations with China, which are already tense, and destroys a fragile reconciliation with South Korea that Japan has worked hard to build in recent years. And why does this matter? Because countering the rise of China requires Japan and South Korea to work together, putting aside historical grievances and focusing on common threats. Similarly, if Takaichi stirs up anti foreign sentiment to appeal to her nationalist base, she will drive away the immigrants. Japan needs to compensate for a shrinking population. She will also tarnish Japan's image as a welcoming and open nation, which is crucial for attracting tourists, a key source of revenue for the economy. So the big question is Takaichi up to the task? The answer is we don't know yet. She assumed power in October 2025, just months before the election, and remains untested. We haven't seen if she can transition from campaigning to effective governance. We haven't seen if she can balance competing pressures from nationalist voters, from financial markets, from international partners, from allies and adversaries. But one thing is certain, opportunities like this do not come often. With 316 seats in the lower house, Takaichi has a two-thirds majority, allowing her to override the upper house, which the LDP does not control. She can push for constitutional amendments, specifically to fully legalize Japan's armed forces. She can pass economic and social reforms that previous leaders shied away from. She can reshape Japan for the next generation. But this opportunity comes with responsibility. If she squanders her support on symbolism and populism, more corrosive alternatives will fester. Trust in democratic politics, already fragile in Japan as in many Western democracies, will erode further, and Japan will not soon grant another leader such a massive opportunity. There is a saying in politics: never let a good crisis go to waste. The idea is that crises create opportunities for change that are impossible in normal times. Japan is not in an acute crisis right now, but it is facing long-standing structural challenges. And Takaichi's election victory has created a moment where major change is possible. But change in which direction? This is the defining question. Takaichi could lead Japan to become a stronger, more open, and more prosperous nation, one that plays a leading role on the world stage and confronts its domestic challenges with bold reforms. Or she could lead it down a narrow nationalist path, one that leaves Japan isolated from partners, alienating the immigrants it needs, and sliding deeper into economic and geopolitical decline. The war is watching because Japan is not just any country. It is the world's fourth largest economy. It is a key democracy in a region dominated by autocracies. It is a major US ally and a crucial counterweight to China. What happens in Japan matters not just to 125 million Japanese people, but to the stability and prosperity of the entire Asia Pacific region and beyond. So, when we look at Sanae Takaichi, the most powerful woman in the world, we see a paradox. She possesses a historic opportunity while facing immense pressure. She has the mandate, she has the moment, she has the support. But does she have the wisdom, the flexibility, and the courage to use them correctly? Only time will answer that question. But one thing is certain, the choices she makes in the coming months and years will shape Japan for decades. She gambled big by calling this snap election, and the Japanese people responded with a landslide victory. Now, she must gamble big once again, not in politics, but in policy. She must risk sweeping reforms, difficult conversations, and changes that may make many uncomfortable but are necessary for the country's future. And that ultimately is the lesson for all of us. In an increasingly uncertain world, in an era where old rules no longer apply, we need leaders willing to confront hard realities and make difficult choices. We need people willing to think long term, not just about the next election, but about the next generation. And we need people who understand that true power is not the ability to do what you want, but the ability to do what is necessary, even when it is hard, even when it is unpopular. Sanae Takaichi now has that power. The question is how she will use it. And the answer will determine not only Japan's fate, but also the country's role in shaping the world of the 21st century.